I really struggled with self-confidence when I was just starting out before I'd publish anything. And I came to the conclusion that, look, my story might not be particularly good, but I am literally the only one who will write it. So, what gave me the confidence to keep going and start publishing was I've got a story rattling around in my head. And if I'm not the one that puts the words on the page, there will be nobody else in the world who will do it for me.
Yeah.
If I don't do this, nobody else will.
This is the Crit RPG Podcast, your one-stop shop for everything Lit RPG, progression fantasy, and Royal Road. Hi, and welcome everyone to the Crit RPG Podcast, the only podcast where the host gets up way too early to welcome people from the United States. With me today is Selkie Myth, author of Beneath the Dragoneye Moons, and also head of Mango Media Publishing, who we will talking about that a little bit later. But hi, Selkie, how you doing?
Hey, pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing fine, thank you. As we have established. So we've been talking for about 10, 12 minutes, but that's in the bonus material. Wink, wink, again. But I thought we might just actually get into it because I have so many questions about Beneath the Dragoneye Moons that I kind of just want to kind of rattle off. And I guess we'll just start with the most obvious one. Why did you write that book, and how and when, and what's the story about that?
So, I initially, like many people, I had the thought in my head rattling around, one day I should write a book. And, I sort of had the idea rattling around in my head. And, after I discovered web novels, and what happened was in 2015, 2016 or so, 2016, Solo Leveling came out. And like many others, I read it and I was enthralled by the story. And, I was big on reading mangas, I was big on reading manhwas, the whole thing. And Solo Leveling just captured my attention in a way other things didn't. And I was so engrossed. I was like, I've heard that there's this thing called a light novel that is based off of. Let me go find it. And, I managed to, with a bunch of Googling, eventually find the light novel and read the bad translation of it. And I ended up, going down that whole rabbit hole. And for a while I was thinking there's got to be an English version of this somewhere. And I kept searching for English versions of, web novels, and I kept not finding anything. And eventually, of all things, I managed to stumble upon a practical guide to evil. And, binge all that. And I was like, yes, okay, there's definitely English stuff going on. And finally, I hear the word Royal Road. And I go to Royal Road, and, this is way long time ago. 2018, I want to say, I finally find it. So, most of the stories that are even, considered the big stories did not even exist on Royal Road then. I know I read everything that I could there. And as I said, this was sort of the early days, and I eventually ran out of good stories because there's only so many stories that are, of high quality on Royal Road that keep going. And I read a bunch of old hiatus stuff, Arcane Emperor, Flow, some really, really old names that, most of the people listening to this podcast probably are like, what on earth are those? They're still in Royal Road. They're hiatus. There's a lot of chapters. You might want to check them out if you want to, get
your heart
blast
broken
from the past. Anyway, I ran out of books in 2020 during the pandemic. Right around the same time I got laid off from my job.
Did you work in tourism as well?
Sorry, what?
Did you work in tourism as well?
I worked for CVS.
Ooh. Okay.
So there is... I don't want to go too in depth as to what was going on there because I was literally the one making the report. So I had a much deeper analysis into what was going on than a lot of people did. Let's say that they got absolutely slammed by COVID. Surprise, the biggest pharmacy chain had some trouble with the healthcare system. And some higher up flexibility did not quite meet new reality in time. I got laid off. It wasn't a big deal. My particular niche and my location did not mesh particularly well. Had a kid on the way, knew we were moving soon. And so, we'd always planned that my wife was primary. And when the kid was born, I'd be, sort of the stay-at-home dad. And I was like, okay, you know what? There's COVID. Nobody's hiring. Anything I get, I'm going to just, move soon. Why don't I try my hand at writing a book? Because you know what? There's no good books right now. There's not, I can do better than this. And I reassured myself that, whatever I wrote was better than machine translation. And I knew that there were way too many people reading machine translation stories. So I sat down and I started to plot. I didn't start writing immediately. I started to think about the story I wanted. I studied every other story that was out there at the time. I was reading stuff like The Legend of Rendidley Ghost Hound to see like, okay, this is clearly very popular. Why is it popular? What is it about it that people like? I don't really quite see it, but clearly people do, and so I dutifully wrote down all the things I thought they were doing well. I studied Meta World Chronicles.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That's a name.
And, studied what they were doing well. What are they doing well? What do people like about this? What is making it successful? I said a bunch of stories. My favorite one, though, was Azarinth Healer. And my conceit was started with the question of what if Ilya from Azarinth Healer actually healed people? Because, you get the title Azarinth Healer and you think, oh, great, it's a story about it. And it is not a story about a healer.
It's about a person punching people.
My question was, what if Ilya actually healed people?
Yeah.
Again, I had a couple more thoughts enter my head, which sort of, were the main ingredients of the story. Another thought I had is, why is everything a medieval period with, castles and princesses? Why don't we ever see classical Rome, classical period story?
Cool.
So, okay, you know what? There's a lot of really cool thematic elements to that time period. Okay, let's throw that element in. The next one was, I was a little frustrated by monsters. People are always making up their own creatures. Dinosaurs existed. There's a million really freaking cool dinosaurs out there and other classical fantasy creatures. Why make up a story when you can give a pterodactyl fire breathing and lightning powers and, have a pretty cool monster there, all while it being able to evoke, the image in someone's mind with a single word? Take a broad view of, fantasy creatures. I said, I'm not limiting myself to one culture. I'm not limiting myself to one part of the world. I'm going to grab fantasy creatures from all around the world. So, in my initial arc, I made sure to include wind weasels because I cannot pronounce the proper names, from Japan, golden crows from Southeast Asia, Selkies from Celtic mythology, couple others here and there. I need to double check what I actually wrote. But basically, it was sort of an indicator that, look, I'm beep, 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 beep. There's things from all over the world here. Because there's just such variety in the world that exists already. I don't need to make anything up. Make a badger with void claws and, the ability to swim through water and you swim through a rock like it's water and you got something pretty cool.
Yeah.
So those were sort of the main ingredients in the book. The last one was stories are always set really far down in history. And I was like, why are stories set far down in history? Why are there never stories at the beginning of history? So instead of writing about, there was this ancient empire a long time ago, I was like, I'm going to write the ancient empire. Granted, I discovered pretty quickly why people write things, further down the line. Oops, that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, we'll say.
Why was that?
Those were sort of the main ingredients that I started with. And then I spent time designing the system. And I said, okay, and this goes back to the research I did. So
why was that a problem? That the ancient
There's
empire
no
thing?
history. You cannot, there's the famous quote, standing on the shoulder of giants.
Yeah.
But there are no giants to stand on. You can't justify, anything beyond, sort of primitive society. It's hard to justify. There's no ancient ruins to explore. There's no old history. With lit RPGs in particular, there's sort of a leveling pyramid. But at the beginning, everyone's sort of pretty low down on that pyramid. It's going to take a lot of time to build up in a way that, gives the main character the ability to progress meaningfully. There are no ancient ruins to explore. There are no, secret horrors locked away. This is the era of, the secret horrors, some are going to come into their own. There are no, ancient established things. You're always at the starting point of things. And, I realized you can tell great stories there, but for the epic of the size I wanted, I hadn't properly considered how the mid and late game works and that it doesn't work.
I want to hear about your system. But I one thing I find super fascinating, for example, is that under Cleopatra, the Egyptians did archaeology because they wanted to find out who built the pyramids, right? Which just was like completely mind blowing because like some of the pyramids were like way older than Cleopatra, like 2,000 years older than that.
Cleopatra is closer to the invention of cell phone than the building of most pyramids.
Yeah, exactly. It's super crazy.
Yes. But even then, when I've only gotten a 5,000 year timeline in total, less time than Egypt existed.
Yeah.
And I also need to justify people moving out of moving into the Stone Age, out of the Stone Age. Like all of a sudden it gets real hard to, have a proper history.
Okay. So you were saying your system then, because I would love to talk about this for a long time, but I also want to talk about the system.
So that was the other thing I studied like heck. And that was why I was reading a lot of stories that I didn't really like, because I wanted to study what beats work really well and what beats just do not work at all. And remember as well, this is the super, super early days of lit RPGs where people have just sort of gotten the idea and have just sort of started writing it. So some more well-known current ideas were, just being thought of for the first time. And one of the things I saw was that everyone had unlimited skills and they just did not work. Because skill sheets just got little absurd. One famous story had a 14,000 word skill sheet or something. They just kept tagging on skills, and it's like, how can you track that everyone's got everything? This doesn't work. You have to have limited skill slots. Everyone had limited classes, which is thank goodness. So there was that. Titles were another big one where nobody seemed to really have a good idea of how they work. I had really gamed them out all the way properly. So that was something else where I said, okay, look, titles, they'd be real fun, but how do you justify what isn't a title? How do you justify how many you can get? How do you justify people not munchkining them? How do you, there were just too many questions and problems with them. If you say you can only obtain a limited number of titles in your lifetime, and then it becomes, okay, what justifies a title existing and not exist? It just, there were too many problems with it. So I mixed titles entirely. There was figuring out my stats, and I always knew I wanted elemental magic. And, I sort of came in with the question, I was doing both stats and elements at the same time. And they actually ended up tying together very nicely, and I'll explain how that happened. I wrote down every single stat I had ever seen from any story, regardless of how much I liked it or not. And, big, long list of absolutely everything that ever existed. And for all of them, I said, do I want this? Do I axe it? Or is it merged with something else? And so I ended up with a big, long list. And the first things to go were the mental stats. Intelligence, wisdom, the ones that made no sense, luck, those went straight out the window because you can't write intelligence and wisdom very well. However, intelligence and wisdoms were often used as placeholders for magic stats. And I said, look, why are we using int and wiz when we're not actually making people smarter or wise when it's just about the magic stats? Let's just make it the magic stats directly. So I made it into magic power, magic control, mana regeneration. I was like, okay, great. This is pretty good. This works. This describes exactly what it is. So another frustration I'd had with int, wiz, and strength, speed, dexterity, what have you, is there's 4 physical stats and 2 magical stats, and a wizard was always going to be stronger than a warrior because they didn't have as many places to stick their stats in, so they could make their stats much higher. And it's like, that's to the poor warriors. I never wanted my system to be balanced because I'm writing a world, not a video game. I don't need balance, but I don't want it to be blatantly, obviously unfair either. So I had to, make sure that there was some modicum of fairness in there. Then we looped around to elements. I knew I wanted elemental magic, but then the question was, okay, if people have elements, if elements are available to them, how are they available to them? What makes someone, attached to lava or fire or water or what have you? And I said, without being able to have everything again. Because again, this was big in the system where, characters were doing absolutely everything under the sun. And it was sort of eye-rolling to read about, the endlessly growing skill lists and, the endless, I can do every sort of magic. So I said, okay, let's assign elements to classes. Let's tie them together. A blacksmith can be a fire blacksmith or a metal blacksmith, but they're not going to be fire and metal. They pick one and they go with it. And I did the same thing for, so it's like, okay, I'm tying elements to classes. So, an ice mage is very, easy to do. They've got all the ice spells, but they can't branch out into water easily because their element isn't water. Their element is ice. Of course, I could take another class for it. And of course, there's some more stuff going on there. But, I tied the elements to the sound. And then I was sort of looking at, okay, what elements do I want? And I started off with, debating, maybe I just want a few elements. Do I want 4 elements, 6 elements? Do I want, cool elements like lightning, what have you? Okay. I was doing this at the same time. I came up with the idea of opposing pairs of elements at the baseline to start with. Fire and water, opposing pair. Wind and earth, light and dark. Okay, I'm getting somewhere. I was writing down my stuff. And then I had the idea, the brainwave of tie stats to elements. Because my stats were also in opposite pairs. Mana and mana regeneration, strength and dexterity, speed and vitality. And then I just sort of had the brainwave of 8 basic elements, 8 stats. Tie each stat pair to an elemental pair, and all of a sudden I had my basics in. And then I really, really wanted lightning to be an element. So I came up with the idea of tier 2 elements, which was, every combination of the tier 1 elements together. Spent, a bunch of time working out what each one was. Some were real difficult. Water plus wood, for example, famously gave me a lot of trouble. And
would you get rot?
Coral is what I initially had. And then I built in myself a safety valve into the system with a genie that could grant wishes, which was really just sort of my way of including a way to edit the system if I needed to. Given the planned its timeline, and eventually I switched it to Sylvan, which was basically my fancy way of saying this is the element around magical woods, ironwood, spring wood, that sort of thing. Cool. Woods with, unusual magical properties. And okay, this element now covers that sort of thing. Which it was actually pretty nice because the water wood pair is opposite to the fire metal pair, which was Crucible, which covers the magic metals. So there was a nice sort of symmetry going on there.
Cool. Nice. Yeah.
So yeah, that's the elemental system. And the idea of the system as well is I wrote down hard rules on what is not permitted by the system, what everything costs in the system. And then it becomes, okay, you can do basically any magic from any book. The question is what is the cost? And, some things under the rules cost a lot more than others. Blinking, for example, is famously expensive, but that's because that follows the rules I set down. Instantly repositioning yourself is an extremely powerful ability, and so it costs a lot of mana. And there's basically a lot of math around how much you can do with how much mana, and so you end up with you don't get low level characters doing big flashy things, but you do get a pretty consistent scaling going on throughout the story. And it also lets, someone say, well, can you do X, Y, and Z? And the answer is yes, but it would cost like this or like that, or you need this other thing, or yeah, you can, but it's so stupid expensive,
Doesn't really make sense. Yeah.
There's not a lot of sense to it. But, that gave me the flexibility to build anything I could imagine, which is nice. The only issue is I sort of have the rule that everyone's a munchkin, where everyone tries to exploit their class to, the fullest extent.
Obviously.
And unfortunately, physics dictates that some things are a lot more efficient than others, which leads to certain class and element combinations being more favored than others because they're simply much more efficient at doing things than, related classes are.
I'm kind of wondering, like, if we have a society like this, right, where everyone has access to powers and so on and so forth, what about? I'm sorry, I don't quite remember. Does everyone have access to powers?
Yes, everyone has access to the system. Everyone has access to classes and skills. There's I've tried to build the society in a way that's flexible for it.
Yeah, exactly.
That recognizes that different people are at different power levels, and also recognizes, hey, we need to have breaks on this. We need to, have control. But at the same time, it's just so innately part of everyone's lives that, it would be surprising if that wasn't the case. Makes sense.
Yeah. So
the other nice thing is it's difficult to get to the, city shattering power levels.
Yeah.
Quickly or easily. And there's also the train of thought that anyone with, shall we say, enough screws loose to do that sort of thing are going to start doing that sort of thing at the lower levels as well. And basically get caught and dealt with before they get to the Shatter City levels of power.
Exactly. So my kind of question is, like, you were saying, like, everyone's a munchkin. I mean, obviously it's for the main party, right? I always wonder what happens to all those people who just, like, who want to do something that the powers don't help them with. Like, what about the writers, the poets, and all that kind of stuff?
So
I mean, yeah.
Well, that's part of the thing with the system is it will help you with anything.
Okay.
So you can get a writer class, you can get writing skills, you can get skills that help you read faster, you get skills that help you write faster. You could have a skill that helps you spot, typos, in the words you've written. You can have a skill that would, let you unwrite a few words to, be like, whoops, I actually meant this. You could get a skill to rearrange words or, make it easier to edit. So, you're not scratching with quill all the time. You could be like, okay, let me twist my hand and rearrange stuff. And similarly, since there's, abilities to rearrange words on the paper like that, there's also offensive applications to that where, if you get into someone else's ledgers, you can rearrange their ledgers a little and all of a sudden, screw with them in that way.
Cool.
But, there are ways to help the poets, but critically, I try not to give information to people with skills. I always try to have it be, it helps you improve what you already have. So, if you read a thesaurus once, it'll help you basically immediately refer to it and, help provide the word that, the thesaurus would provide if you're, thinking what's another word for this. But if you've never read this thesaurus, it'll never help you make that connection, or, if you don't know the word, it'll never help you connect that word together. But yeah, there's absolutely skills for the writers, for the poets, for the painters, for, the artists in the world.
I just kind of like the thing that I wondered about was what would happen to. I mean, okay, so everyone can kind of like take the pick at skills. I'm just wondering if there are people, if people would exist in a society like that actually are like, hey, I don't want to participate in this rat race. I mean, there have to be, right? So
like you kind of have to participate, because if I am, let's go with the classic blacksmith. If I'm a blacksmith hiring apprentices, I'm looking for someone with the apprentice class or a related one. There's a lot of variants. Classes are extremely flexible. It could be a learner, it could be a beginner, it could be an apprentice, it could be a student. It could be. I'm looking for a lot of people like that, and I'm looking for them to train them up and raise their skills. And if someone just says I'm staying at level 8, I'm not planning on classing up, I'm going to skip over them in favor of the person who does have the ability to learn quicker and more and actually has skills to help them out. I'm not going to, go with someone who doesn't have anything. Similarly, if I'm looking to commission, a hoe for my farm, I'm not going to the level 8, sitting outside the forge saying I can do it. I'm going to the level, 100 blacksmith, next door being like, hey, I can do this in a day, as opposed to the other guy who's like, I can do this in a week. Like, there's just such an innate advantage given that, there's no reason to not participate. Now, that being said, I thought about the question of what happens when you grab a class that you realize is wrong for you, or you are forced to take a class that you didn't like. And so I came up with the idea of being able to reset and revert. So if you a class up mark, you can say, oops, let me go back to the beginning and try this again, or let me revert to what my class was at a lower level.
I like that because it makes the system more egalitarian, right? Because like I always try to like think about the people who kind of got shafted over by stuff. We could go down that rabbit hole for a long time.
I will say there's some interesting aspects where if you realize a class is wrong for you shortly after taking it, you still have to go the entire distance to the next class up before you can do something about it. I didn't want people able to reset willy-nilly, so I made it so you have to get to a class up. But there's a particularly long stretch between class ups where if you screwed up in that segment, you're a little screwed. But at the same time, it did make it so that the safety valve isn't too abusable because, I went, because everyone's a munchkin now. It's like, okay, how do you munchkin this? And I realized if you're an immortal, you can rotate through the classes in a way to keep improving their quality again and again and again until you finally get to the highest quality and then try to shoot up from there. So there's abuse in the reset mechanism as well, which makes the whole thing just a little more interesting because, I try to think through all the implications of, what does this mean? Who abuses it? How do they abuse it?
So many questions because you mentioned all about like, hey, plotting and kind of, planning stuff. Are you a plotter or a pantser?
So I started off more pantser where, I just put the elements in and said go, but I always had an idea of what I was doing and what I wanted the plot to be. So, as I've done more, I've become a little more of a plotter where I write down an outline, which lets me more easily put in hooks for the future and, more easily lay out what's going to be happening next and later. Because people really like seeing the foreshadowing and, being able to foreshadow things. The doesn't always work out. And occasionally, you know, I've gone into a system where I put an interlude where I got the hooks for what's coming next. Occasionally it doesn't work out too well. And it becomes a little awkward. Where I've explicitly set up this is going to happen, and then what's going to happen, you know, the characters decide to move around a bit more. So I plot it out, but at the same time, if the characters don't want to cooperate with the plot, that doesn't happen, and I go with what the characters want. And I've had some big plot points just completely demolished as a result, which has been real unfortunate, but, you know, it's better to stay true to the characters and the characterization than to try to force plot.
That's very true.
So, you know, I'm a bit of a mix where, you know, I've got an idea of what's going on, but, you know, it's also serial writing where I need to, you know, be writing those 3 chapters a week, if not more.
How long are your chapters usually?
So it depends. I've got, if it's not, unless it's extreme circumstances, 2,000 words is my bare minimum. My average is 3,500 words.
Okay. Cool.
My longest chapter, as I said, was 8,000 words and change. I believe my stats, my average chapter length is about 3,000 words. And it's after I've split up a couple of very large chapters into several smaller chunks. So probably 4,000 words or so.
Seems, I mean, that's super reasonable. I've experimented with 1,500 word chapters. It didn't really work because they just became a bit incohesive, even if they were like the same scene, you know. But I totally agree with you. 2,000 is a good minimum. I feel it's a good range. That being said, or in the same vein, I guess, what's the best advice you've ever gotten as a writer?
So read a lot, write a lot is, you know, the best advice I got. And, you know, as I said, I studied the heck of what everyone else was doing and what made the successful story successful before I started. It helped as well that I liked the popular stuff and I wanted to write something like that. If there's no market for what people want to, if there's no market for it, then people aren't going to read it. People like the popular stuff for a reason. Similarly, you know, whenever I got stuck, you know, the question, what happens next, has always managed to keep me going and writing what happened next. So, you know, those 2 pieces of advice have sort of been, you know, the bedrock of how I've written everything.
So
and then,
read a lot,
you know,
write a lot, and kind of keep writing to see what happens next.
Well, ask yourself what happens next. And then, you know, on the confidence note, you know, I really struggled with self-confidence that, you know, when I was just starting out before I published anything. And I came to the conclusion that, look, my story might not be particularly good, but I am literally the only one who will write it. Nobody else is going to write my story for me. If I don't do this, nobody else will. So, you know, that was sort of what gave me the confidence to keep going and, you know, start publishing was I've got a story rattling around in my head. And if I'm not the one that puts the words on the page, there will be nobody else in the world who will do it for me.
Same. I think what I like to do is just write exactly like you said, what I want to write. I'm the person that can do this, and no one else really can because no one else has a screwed up brain like you or I or any other author, right? And I think that's a very good point. And like many people, you actually started writing. Well, I think you actually had more success in mind than most people I talk to. Within like, hey, how does this work? What makes stories successful, and how can I kind of incorporate it into my own story? Whereas some people I met were just like, hey, I'm just bummed out. I just kind of want to write something that's fun as a hobby, and then it kind of took off. Is that a fair assessment?
So I never thought I would take off, but I laid the groundwork to, you know, succeed just in case. So, for example, one of the things I noticed is a lot of authors and stories died when they went, hey, people really like this. I'm going to make the jump to Patreon. And now all of a sudden I need to triple my output in order to, you know, get a backlog on Patreon for people to go to while maintaining my still output. I saw a lot of authors and a lot of stories die on that step. So I said, okay, you know what? I'm going to set up my Patreon and get my backlog done ahead of time, just in case, so I've got something, ready from the get-go. So I never have to struggle with that step. I set up a Discord ahead of time, just if people want to chat. I've heard, a lot of people struggling with that step. Let me make sure I've got that step done and out of the way ahead of time. And a couple other similar things of, I don't think I'm going to succeed. Just in case, let me make it possible to succeed.
Exactly. And you can also reap the fruits of that labor on a way smaller scale. Getting 3 or 4 people in your Discord and talking to them every day, and they're nice and they like what you're writing, is way enough, right? Because I always rail against this point, because I've met so many people who approach writing as kind of like this lifeline of, I hate my job, I don't want to do something else, and I need to write now, I need to make money doing this. And I think that way lies failure in dragons.
It's difficult to jump in expecting it to be successful and expecting, a level of success. I will say as well that all of the hyper successful authors I've talked to have said the same thing. This is a job. Treat it like a job.
Yeah.
Sit down, spend the hours on it. Spend, the time and the energy and the effort like you would any other job. Yeah. You don't have the motivation, you've got writer's block. Well, motivation starts a story, discipline finishes a story.
Nice.
For me as well, the advice I give as well is, remove your shame bone. Go out, shamelessly self-promote. My personal key to success was I went to every single Discord, read the rules on all of them, and everywhere I could self-promote my story, I shamelessly self-promoted my story. Became a joke in some servers that, the first of every month I would be in the Discord, plugging my story. Once a month, I felt was perfectly fine, interacting with the community otherwise. Also, big thanks again to Azarinth Healer and its Discord, where, I started off plugging the story, and a lot of people said, yeah, this is pretty similar to Azarinth Healer. We really like this. Okay, let's, do that. So, managed to capture a good amount of attention there early on. And yeah, just self-promoted on Reddit, self-promoted on Discord, self-promoted on Royal Roads. A lot of people say, oh, I don't know. It sort of feels weird. It's like, yeah, but you got to do what you got to do. There's, you can try to be, one of the extremely rare success stories where you just let pure organic word of mouth do it for you. Or you can be one of the, the so-so stories where the word of, by making your own word of mouth, advertising shamelessly, you get the initial momentum needed to get going.
Is there something that you wish you could go back and change about the first part of the story, or anything else like that?
So I did change the first parts of the story I wasn't too happy with. Of course, if I was a more experienced writer, I would have, started off with several differences that, I only obtained with experience and retrospect. Dragoneye Moons is my first writing project ever. So, Jesus. I was a completely amateur going into this. So, obviously there were some amateur related mistakes. I had never been part of any of the Discord communities before doing this. It was only when I was, really gearing up to get going in the last, week that I realized there was a million Discord communities out there that I was just not in touch with at all. There's some editing and other related stuff that, I would probably go back and change. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with what I did. I went in with my eyes open, with my plans made, with the groundwork properly laid out. One stupid thing I did, I thought everyone went, into Royal Road with a backlog of chapters at the very least, just a few ready to, go so they could get to their posting schedule. No, but most people don't go in with a backlog of chapters. They don't go in with a and not just hold writing each chapter, hoping they'll make their dead. That was to me.
And like, again, it really depends on what you want to do, right? If you want to actually kind of like see how far you can take this, then absolutely, please have a backlog. Because if you don't, you're gonna have a bad time, like a really bad time. Because hitting, like, life is so unpredictable. You get a flu or a cold or, God help it, COVID, and suddenly you can't like write for a week or even two. Suddenly your backlog is like you're shrinking, or people are asking and you're dropping followers because people are like, well, the story's on hiatus, it's over. So yeah, you gotta be on that. Yeah, there's more questions about stuff like editing that I actually have, because obviously you write a little bit faster than your backlog, hopefully, but you don't. Okay, then there's nothing gained, really. I mean, you're still trying to hit deadlines.
I post 3 chapters a week and I write 3 chapters a week. So,
Okay.
but what it does is it takes the pressure and the stress off. I cannot tell you how many weeks where I've gotten my first chapter done on Thursday, and then, a second one on Saturday, third one on Sunday, and I don't need to, be stressing over, oh God, I'm missing my deadline. Lets me relax enough to hit the 3 chapters in a week.
Awesome.
Because I'm chill about it. It's sort of the old axiom that where, by being stressed about it, you make it all worse. Well, with the backlog, I'm not stressed about it. And as long as I hit the 3 in the week, it doesn't matter what days of the week I hit them on.
Don't be stressed.
And so
Don't be stressed.
I personally work on a Monday to Sunday schedule where my I start on Monday and the third chapter written by Sunday evening. But because I post Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I would have to, kind of to knock off the first chapter in a single day every time otherwise. And I can't do that. I rarely manage to a whole chapter done in a single day. So yeah, like the backlog lets me relax. It lets me, be chill enough to do things. And it also lets me edit to a high standard where I'm able to produce a much higher quality product than people who just, throw their draft up onto Patreon, which does work for quite a lot of authors. And I'm not knocking people who work that way, but it doesn't work for me. I need the time to edit. It gives my beta readers enough time to tackle it on their own schedule. So, I beta read for a couple other stories and, there'll be a 4 a.m. ping of chapters up. And then at 6 a.m., okay, it's posted. And it's like, I was asleep. I'm sorry I couldn't help you, but I was asleep during that time. When it large enough backlog, it gives my beta readers almost an entire month to tackle things before it goes up.
So yeah, backlog even before Patreon. I get it. Yeah, pretty cool.
And that lets me hit my Patreon thing, and I started scheduling posts so my patrons know it is coming out at exactly the same time every time. And that's a relatively recent development, but I like it because it gives predictability. The key to success I found as well, or one of them, is you set expectations and you meet the expectations. And if you set them and you meet them and you communicate clearly what they are, people will like you. People will be happy. People, will, start cursing your name as being unreliable, because there are, I don't want to name any names, but there are quite a lot of authors in the web serial community that are not very reliable. There are certain stories that I'm sure listeners can think of that I say they were really popular a few years ago and the author went on an eternal hiatus, but every once in a while they post a chapter, once a year, get everyone's hopes up and then disappear again. And
what's this? Another ad? Yeah, because I'm not Zogarth and I really need money. Joke aside, if you're enjoying this podcast, check out Patreon. Like, subscribe, you know the drill. Speaking of Patreon, by the way, there is at least half an hour of content for every hour of podcast you're listening to. For Raven's Dagger, for example, we have 2 hours of bonus content that you can enjoy. All right, I'll see you there and enjoy the show.
There is a certain threads of, it's an amateur space. And so there is some amateur behavior and, that's sort of to be expected. But it also makes readers really skittish in a sense.
Oh yeah, that I totally see that. Yeah, that's a very good point. I was going to say that, like, hey, if they just want to do this and if they don't want to be successful, that's fine. But I completely agree with you that it has a ripple effect upon the wider community because people are more perceptive about stuff suddenly vanishing, or they're more aware or more afraid of it, I guess. This is a very good point.
It's more like and it's like,
Mm,
oh, you can spend years building up a reputation.
mm,
And once you've built up a reputation, I will say you can rarely drop the ball, and, people, and as long as it's communicated, people will understand. But,
mm.
there's the famous expression, it takes, 10 years to build a reputation and 10 minutes to destroy it.
Yeah.
Um, and,
In
in this particular, a lot of readers are willing to, not really willing to trust authors for a long time until,
mm.
they really prove themselves.
In German, there's a wonderful idiom that translates roughly to once you have ruined your reputation, you can live like a god because you don't care about anything anymore. But I completely agree with you. If you want to do this professionally, yes. And I actually wanted to kind of go into that because it's something I've heard a lot recently. Expectations and hitting them and presenting them. That is true in both your schedule. Sorry. Sorry. Both your schedule, but also in writing, right? What you
Mhm.
promised me in the first 2 chapters, you better be delivering in the story. Max, I'm talking to myself here.
I wouldn't necessarily the first few chapters, but the start of the book. Yes, I
Mm,
famously take 30 chapters for the adventure to really begin, when
mm,
everything's pretty much laying the groundwork for it.
mhm.
Um, Arguably the
How do
first
you
19 chapters, but
how do you keep people engaged for 30 chapters?
well,
Because
I dropped them all
because
at
I
the start.
what?
I
Hmm?
dropped them all at the beginning, and I was slowly unveiling the world's secrets. But that's
Mm,
how long it took for the main character to leave home and
mm,
get going. But there was sort of adventures in her hometown, and
ah,
people could clearly see the groundwork was being laid out in a way to make things work. And I was following some
mm,
rules of thumb on percentages. And I knew percentage wise I was good with how long I had planned the story to be.
mm.
But yeah, I know it's not for everyone. But at the same time, I also knew the space was towards binging and reading a lot and doing a lot of stuff. I'm not. I don't write with an eye towards the publishing sphere. I write with an eye towards the web serial sphere.
Mm. And I just recently encountered or understood how different that is. Because I personally don't think the stories that I want to tell are good for web serials, and I use Royal Road is like almost exclusively as a beta reader space. I want to give people a story; they can read it for free, and if they give me feedback, awesome. If not, that's also okay, right?
Mhm.
But if you're writing for web serial, you have to have some considerations that you don't have, and vice versa.
It's not so much that I'm writing towards web serial. It's more like web
Hmm.
serial is the right format for the way I want to tell the story.
Awesome,
A
that's
little
great.
little bit of
Mhm.
which one goes first.
Pretty cool. Yeah, chicken egg. I guess. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was that. Talking about one thing you would go back to and change, but there really isn't all that much. I always get two different answers, like one or two, one of the two. Like either it's like, oh, I would completely redo the first story, or there isn't really all that much I would change, or I've already changed it. But you mentioned that you went back and changed a lot of the first story. When did you do that, and how did you fit that into your schedule?
So I'm not sure when I did it. It was more nothing was particularly large scale changes. There were a lot of just sort of characterizations
Mm,
and beefing it up, so to speak.
mm,
Um, and I squeezed it into my end weeks, which is,
ah,
1 week a month. I don't post the chapters, and that gives me a pressure valve to catch up if I've missed anything, to,
mhm,
edit things thoroughly, to occasionally dabble in side projects. And the rewrite was a dabble in a side project, essentially, where, I put the whole thing up because those are the only chapters that weren't beta read. I dropped my initial things, and that's when, I dropped my initial 30 chapters. And that's when people started, coming along, and, someone, one of my, oldest fans and friends at this point, now beta readers, showed up and was like, hey, I, I've got question X and Y and Z, and this doesn't make any sense to me. And so basically that's when I started beta readers, but there's nothing on the early stuff. That was, pure raw, just me, just my own editing and everything.
Yeah.
And I grew so much as a writer, and I just wasn't quite happy with some of the beats of the story. And, there were some recurring, complaints. And so I went in and I just tried to make it stronger to, my current quality at the time. And I feel like I succeeded. Just quietly re-uploaded it and moved on.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that. I think you were also at this point kind of successful already, right? So if you imagine you were a new author and you had written, let's say, the first 2 arcs of your story, and it's already like you were already done with it, and you did get some feedback, or positive or negative, on your first few chapters, would you push on, like considering that you still want to do web serial, right? So not talking about me here. Would you push on, or would you kind of go back and redo the first chapters to make sure that the funnel is better?
So the rewrite spiral of death is a real thing. And I spent years avoiding rewriting the start because I didn't want to enter the rewrite spiral of death. There's sort of the infamous, when authors say, I'm taking a pause and rewriting the start of my book, I don't like it, or rewriting the entire thing because I'm not happy with it. Infamously, the story dies. There's only a very, very small example of successful rewrites. And for the most part, the story is the author's not going to finish. The author's not going to come back. The following drops off. It's all bad all around. The best advice I can give, if you've written the first few arcs, because I had written the first 3 or 4 arcs by the time I was, starting to post and getting the first feedback. I just kept going. I kept going, and it was only when I felt like I had a little bit of breathing room that I slowly start to rewrite the chapters in that breathing room I had, while maintaining my schedule, my normal schedule. And, only when it was done that I was like, okay, let me just go back in, re-upload it, quietly mention, in one line of an announcement that the story has been updated and rewritten, and carry on.
Did you get beta feedback on the new beginning?
Yes, actually. And that was where I got a lot of, sort of the big difference was I was able to ask my beta readers, because I actually had beta readers at last, to say, hey guys, here is the new, opening arc. Can I get your feedback on this, please? And one of my big draws for beta readers is, frankly, you get the chapters much early and ahead of time. And, you get the chapters a month ahead of time, and just give me any feedback you've got on it. That's sort of the deal, so to speak. So when it's rewriting the early chapters, I don't blame them at all. Most of the beta readers didn't want to read it because it wasn't interesting to them, because it wasn't something new. And as I said, I can't blame them. They're doing this out of the goodness of their heart and their desire to read more chapters. So please reread a bunch of chapters is not exactly enticing. So I only had, 1 or 2 betas, actually check it out.
Please spot all the grammar mistakes.
That's more than 0. And they're able to help me, find some typos and some problems. And I hammered it all out and released it.
Awesome. Pretty dope. Okay. Right. We are nearing the end of the main part of the podcast already. Time flies, man. Really, I thought it was like 15 minutes, but now I'm looking at the time, it's like 1 hour 8. So why don't you tell me about one book that you love and why it is awesome?
So right now I am absolutely loving Super Supportive.
Yeah.
It is ranked number 1 on Railroad for a reason. It
Yes.
is incredibly good, incredibly well done. And I'm hyper aware that today is Wednesday and another chapter is coming out, probably within the next 12 hours. And it's, all I can do is just stop going to my email and hitting refresh, 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 and, see when the next chapter comes out. Uh, I cannot wait for the next chapter of that.
Hmm. I still haven't read that because I feel as though if when I do, I will be crushed and never read again.
Uh,
Yeah, awesome. So tell me why it's awesome. I mean, if there are people who haven't read Super Supportive yet, is what I'm saying. So tell me why it's awesome. Convince me.
So the people like it because of, and there's a piece of advice I got, and, something that sort of stuck in my mind is stories are emotional journeys.
Mm-hmm.
And super supportive when you strip away all of the settings trappings, which are done very well, is an extremely well written emotional journey. And I think that at the end of the day, when you try to boil down all the other factors away, that is the one that makes it successful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I could go on about the system and the characterizations and the people.
Please
So
do.
many other things, when you boil it down to what is the bare essence, it's the emotions
Mm.
and how well done they all are and how you can really feel what is happening and what is going on.
Mm-hmm. So not having read it, this allows me to ask some really noobish questions, and I'm sure people will stone me to death for it. Maybe, hopefully, please don't. Um, does the system itself support the emotional journey? And if so, how?
Yes. And it would be a lot of spoilers to tell you how. So I'm
Okay,
flipping to
fair
tell you.
enough. Fair
Um,
enough.
The answer is yes, but the details are all extreme spoilers, especially for some of the really big parts. Because I've talked with the author directly about a few different things about the story. Um, so mouth is shut. Yeah, I'm not telling you.
Yeah. I really wanted to ask Slaika to come onto the podcast, and if they ever open their DMs on Railroad, maybe they'll see it, but maybe not.
And
So
DM them on Patreon. Spend the money. DM them on Patreon. They might answer.
cool. Yeah, super supportive. That sounds like, well, super. I keep meaning to read it, but right now I'm reading Fire and Song, the next Warform book. That's
I
also
subscribe
super
to that
well.
Patreon, so I'm not busy reading at this stage. I already read it.
It's
I'm
so well done.
I'm sure I'm
Um,
missing some things with the, because I read basically the first draft unedited version. So, I'm missing the epigraphs and what have you.
yeah,
Um,
it it
but
it
it's very well
shows.
done.
It shows that they really take a lot, like a crap ton of time to edit this thing. You can totally see it because you get it by contrast, right? Character interactions are just a little more intertwined. They feel more natural. The story flows really smoothly with all the edges sanded off. That's stuff that you can't do in a first draft. Like if that's a first draft, I'm just gonna quit because it's really, really good.
So, as I said, I try to have a long editing process even before my
Yes.
Patreons get it.
Mhm.
Um, but I will say one of the hallmarks I've noticed of successful serial writers is
Mhm.
they do write extremely clean first drafts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where they managed to get something very close to the right beats the first time.
Mhm.
Very rarely are they editing and re-editing and going over things again and again,
Mhm.
um, because there's not the time in the sphere to make that happen and work.
Yeah, unfortunately, which I think sometimes is to their detriment. I mean, I like editing. I really do love editing. Maybe a bit too much, but sometimes I really wish that people would take more time to edit. But I actually want to ask you about that. But you know what? I'm going to ask you that in the bonus material. The question is going to be how your editing process looks like. I mean, you've touched upon it a little bit more already, but I kind of want to like dig more into that. But before we get into that, do you have shout-outs that you want to make?
I always have an absolute million of them. And
Go ahead.
you mentioned the Mango Media thing, so I am conflicted on a couple of my shout-outs because
I would still love to have you on as a publisher.
I'm making my disclaimer so people know that I have an interest in some of the stories I am shouting out and some of the authors I'm shouting out.
Awesome.
Because, Mango Media is partly to, help me publish the stories I really like. And that also includes my friends' stories that I really like. And I say, hey, can I go publish this for you? And, the two of us, come to an agreement. And so, Ravensdagger, for example, I am publishing a good number of his stories. So this is my shout out. I have somewhat of a conflict of interest in it. I want to make sure people know it. Cat Strut, for example, is one of his stories. I'm not publishing that one. Really enjoy it. I know he's working very hard to get it on Popular this week. It should be there. And, I suspect the moment he gets it on there, the better it'll do. I'm subscribed to Void Herald's, Patreon for both of his stories, Blood and Fur and Commerce Emperor.
Yeah.
Not a good idea, just mentioning what stories I'm, putting my money. I'm subscribed to Mark of the Fool. I'm subscribed to Industrial Strength Magic.
I've never heard about that one. What's that one?
Industrial Strength Magic is by Necronomicon. It's a superhero world where a guy sort of has both superhero and magic powers because there's also mages that show up from it's complicated. He sort of has magic powers, but he doesn't actually have magic powers. But what he's figured out is how to make machines sort of cast magic in a sense.
Oh, wow.
That's cool. What is the bare minimum of brain neurons that need to be stimulated in a certain way from, a petri dish grown octopus or something. So he can sort of integrate magic and technology together that way. And does magic sort of on an industrial scale, hence the title Industrial Strength Magic.
Yep.
It's got, basically most of the superhero trappings and, this guy's doing some superhero stuff as a tinkerer and, magic stuff. So it's a lot of fun. I'm enjoying that. I read most of the big stories. There's Ultimate Level 1 that I've just started reading.
That small story.
Death Healer, I'm a big fan of because it was, inspired by Dragoneye Moons, among other things. So
nice.
You can really see the inspiration in there. So, I'm enjoying that one. It's actually not popular this week. Oh, Death Healer.
Whoa, actually, really? Wow.
In second place right now. It's really just jumped right up there.
I am in awe and also jealous.
Of course, there's, Changeling by Macadamius, which is just absolutely fantastic. I'm, rabid at the mouth for the next chapter. I read a lot of stories and I like a lot of them. There's the Neil Beware of Chicken side story, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
Which, has a million double entendres all over the place.
The blurb is so good. The blurb is tremendous.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that I'm interested in and reading. I can't wait for the next Stargazer's War to come out, for example. Which is extremely well written by the amazing Nixia. Thundamoo always has some new trauma to read.
Oh yeah.
Rhaegar, who wrote Azarinth Healer, which is, the big inspiration for Dragoneye Moons, has Infrason Berserker out and about, quietly posting chapters. I take my advice of read a lot, write a lot seriously, where, I try to read whenever I'm not writing, whenever I can a spare minute. Right now on my phone, I'm also making my way through Shadow Slave, which has interesting beats and plots. Web serial, but not a Royal Road one.
Yep. I've heard that mentioned a lot. People, yeah, it's on a web novel, but yeah. And this is my mandatory disclaimer. We do not support web novel in here because web novel has quite predatory contracts, so don't. But yeah. Anyway, Selkie, thank you so much for this podcast. We are going to keep going because I have more questions about editing and all that kind of stuff, and also about how you keep up your reading speed and your writing speed and how you keep it separate. But we are going to talk about that, well, after the main show is over. If you want to listen to that, dear listener, then you can please subscribe to Patreon. Selkie, any last words before we move on?
No, that's all.
Okay, awesome. Well, in that case, thank you so much. Sorry for the abrupt end there. My editing program has a bit of a hiccup, and apparently there's nothing I can do to fix it. So let me just say it like this. Thank you so much for listening. Selkie also says hi, and I really hope that you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to hear more, go check out Patreon, and please, while you're here, do the whole YouTube thing. So like, subscribe, click where you want to click. It really helps me out because the more followers I get, the more views I get, and the more views I get, the more there's a chance that I can actually make something out of this and have more time and do even more podcasts. There is going to be a special podcast coming out sometime, I think, next week, where I invited Heath Miller and Shoutouts together, and we're going to be doing a bit of a Q&A for the release of Book 10 of He Who Fights with Monsters. I hope you're looking forward to that, and yeah, I'll see you then. Right, I almost forgot. Heath told me this trick.